Hello, everyone. Welcome to my space on Russia, the Ukraine, and yearning for geopolitical catastrophe. Yes, we're going to talk about that. I do want to talk about just the ins and outs of where we are with Russia right now, but I also wanted to focus on just a little exchange I had with a self described socialist. Um, I have actually invited Caleb Maupin onto the program, and he politely got back to me. It was a little short notice. He's not going to be here, but that's totally fine. Um, I guess I was a little rough with him, and he was a little rough back. So all's fair in love and war. But I don't want to just send out mean tweets. I want to explain my position coherently on this issue. So we're going to talk about the ins and outs of the Russia situation in Ukraine. What can we expect? And then I want to talk a little bit more about geopolitical catastrophe, the fall of the old order, throwing people into the dustbin, creating a new regime, and all that goes into that. So I think this should be a lively discussion. I will say this before I begin. I also don't want to be one of these Twitter accounts. Perpetrators of this will remain nameless, that are constantly shrieking about World War III and that the elites are just insane and they're going to do us all in and they are just frothing at the mouth for blood. I actually understand where that position comes from. I think very often our elites can lead us into terrible situations. They make terrible decisions. They seem to froth at the mouth and have bloodlust when it comes to many of their actions. Yemen could be an example of this. Um, but when it comes to big wars and moving into something that could eventuate in a land war or a nuclear campaign, I genuinely take the position that they're not stupid enough to just launch into that willy nilly. And I think that's a sound position to take. Although, in this crisis, I will also admit that there does seem to be a kind of sleepwalking effect. I think there's a famous book on World War One called The Sleepwalkers. There seems to be a sleepwalking effect where Putin has amassed 100,000 troops at Ukraine's border. We keep giving red line type signals. Putin will respond with, the CIA involvement, blah, blah, blah. And it almost does seem like both sides aren't quite willing to budge on this, and that we might create a world war, some kind of world war scenario, an international conflict due to some damn thing in Ukraine. And this would be, I guess, both bizarre on one level, but also kind of characteristic, where you have this hotspot that touches on a fault line in the geopolitical order. Yet, I don't think any reasonable person would say that Ukraine is part of vital interest to the United States. Vital interests are, of course, in the Western Hemisphere and in the Middle East. And you can say of that what you will, but those are vital interests. Obviously, something like the Monroe Doctrine makes a lot of sense. But the idea of pushing on Ukraine just does strike a lot of reasonable observers as insane. Are you really willing to get into a big war with Russia? Because with Russia, it would be a big war. You're not engaging in a proxy campaign. You're not engaging in, Syria, where they might take one side, we take the other, etc. No, you would be confronting a hegemon, mano a mano, and that's something else. Russia is not a massive economic power like China. Its economy is roughly the size of Italy's, believe it or not, but it is absolutely a great power in the sense that it has thousands, hundreds of thousands of nuclear weapons. I don't know the exact number. I'm not sure they do either. Russia clearly has the ability to destroy the world 100 times over. Additionally, it has a memory, a historical memory, not just a kind of far off tradition, but an historical memory of being a great power, of having a say in the world, of being an empire. It even still, even though I think it's largely a rather backward country today, it still has a whiff of ideology about it, going back to the Cold War. And I will actually talk about that in response to Caleb's tweets. So let me just read those, and this will probably get me started in talking about this. So I cruelly tweeted. So first off, Caleb Maupin tweeted out, this was yesterday, any socialist who is worthy of the name should be screaming at the top of their lungs about the danger of World War III right now. We are on the edge of an epic disaster. U.S. troops out of Eastern Europe, no NATO weapons to Ukraine, stop war drive against Russia. I responded rather caustically, any socialist who is worthy of the name, and not just a shill for a Russian regime onto which he projects his fantasies, would be yearning for a global catastrophe that would end the old world and set the stage for a new. Now, my point was this, is that if you actually are a socialist and you aren't just kind of a liberal, what's the right term? A liberal with a hard on. That is a liberal who really wants a lot more than, say, the Democratic Party is offering right now. Then on some level, maybe you might not say it publicly, you would kind of yearn for such a catastrophe. Because the United States, the only advanced industrialized country that doesn't offer even Medicare for all, even that form of socialism, that according to you is a global imperial power that spreads free markets and free market ideology wherever it goes. And if you are a socialist, I'm not sure that you would be exactly enthusiastic about Russia. Russia is not the Soviet Union. It is not a beacon of hope for the left. It's a rather backward country, to be honest. But I have noticed this, and I don't think this is a mainstream phenomenon, but I do think that this is a pronounced phenomenon on the alt-right and alt-left, as it were, is to project a lot of fantasies onto Russia. And so in the alt-right, or dissident right, or whatever they want to call themselves, you'll hear a lot of talk about how, Russia, Putin's a badass. I mean, he takes his shirt off and rides horses in the snow and so on and so forth. He won't accept gay pride and woke parades or whatever. And additionally, you'll hear it from kind of other members of the alt-right writ large of, Orthodox Russia, or that the world is going through a process of re-traditionalization, that the globalists are losing, and that everyone wants a kind of patriotic alternative, maybe we could say autarky and old-time religion of the past. And Russia's an example of the new wave. Russia's kind of a vanguard country, in fact, and not a backward country. Well, I've said it over and over. I don't think Russia is a vanguard of anything. I think Russia is behind the West in terms of cultural decadence, and I think it will surely catch up. in terms of orthodoxy, there has been an interesting Orthodox revival, um, vis-a-vis, say, 30 or 40 years ago when it was living under a least ostensibly atheistic regime, though the Orthodox Church was working hand in glove in some ways with the Soviet state. This was decades after the Soviet state was, openly attacking the Orthodox Church and demolishing cathedrals and so on. I don't believe that you should thus read traditionalism into that. Orthodoxy is really tied up with national identity. So is Christianity, I would say, everywhere, but it's in a very different form in the United States. You can also look at markers of social dysfunction that tell a different story. Things have gotten a lot better in Russia since a high point or a low point in the mid-90s in terms of things like alcoholism, general dysfunction, domestic dysfunction, and abortion rates. Abortion is still highest in Eastern Europe and Russia than it is anywhere else in the world. You can make of that what you will, but as someone who has traveled to Russia, the notion that I had entered some kind of trad paradise never really struck my mind. And I'm not saying that to diss Russia or anything like that. I'm simply being realistic and not projecting some kind of fantasy onto another country. There is a kind of maybe an interesting story to be told of these countries that have been kind of beacons of something. Russia was not considered a beacon of anything. It was maybe considered almost oriental or exotic, from the perspective of the West for some time. But certainly after 1917, a lot of fantastical notions of progress and a new world were projected onto Russia. And I think that's kind of continued to this day. Russia is going to pursue strategic interest, and to either project onto it, a bastion of socialism or a bastion of traditionalism is just strange and bizarre. And the fact that both the alt-right and the alt-left do this might actually tell you something. That it's a screen onto which to project things. But Russia is going to pursue Russia's interests. And those interests are regional, you could say, or imperial. But additionally, if you are a socialist and not just a liberal with a hard on, then why are you, trying to avoid a conflict and making these demands that will never be fulfilled? Like, no NATO in Eastern Europe. Why are you demanding that? What does that have to do with socialism? It just sounds like you're a Russian partisan, because that's not going to happen. NATO expansion post-Cold War has been going on for a long time. And it's a very tricky subject, and it's a difficult subject, and it has to do with balance of power and resource allocation. But why are you, as a socialist who apparently his main concern is the working class, why are you worried about that? It just sounds like you are regurgitating Russia's geopolitical interest and putting a cloak of socialism over it, when there's no reason to believe that that's actually promoting socialism. It's just simply promoting Russia. So if you're just going to promote Russia, why don't you just say it? And in terms of geopolitical catastrophes, 1917 doesn't occur if there is not a world war. A revolution was actually attempted before 1917, and it failed dramatically, some 10 or 12 years before that. It occurred because of the chaos that was brought on by Russia's entry into the World War, its effective defeat. the hands of Germany the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which gave Germany large swaths of land in Eastern Europe, a provisional government, kind of parliamentary chaos. A Soviet communism would have been impossible absent the First World War. So why are you so eager for peace if you're a socialist? And I say this speaking completely amorally and, looking at things ruthlessly. Why would you want to perpetuate the status quo of the world and Russia if you are a socialist? Now, if you're simply a liberal with a hard on, then okay, fair enough. But again, you should announce yourself as I'm a liberal with a boner, as opposed to claiming that you are a socialist. Much like you should announce yourself as an advocate for Russia, as opposed to claiming that you're a socialist. Very similarly, I don't think we can imagine an American-led neoliberal order absent the Second World War and its outcome. America entered late. It was extremely powerful at the time, of course, but still had some isolationist sentiments to it. But it entered late. It survived without its home front being attacked in the slightest. Russia was extremely damaged. Germany was in rubble to a great extent. Britain was already on the way out, but had been weakened still. And in that catastrophe, a new world could be created, an American-led world that we are still in. So if you want to change the game, the way to do that is catastrophe. And I hate to be this like amoral and ruthless. Well, I guess I don't hate it that much, but I hate to say I hate to be this amoral about things, but them the facts. That's how the cookie crumbles. That's how history unfolds. But again, I don't know what really is going to happen if we turn our sights back onto the Russia situation. I don't know exactly what is going to happen, and I don't know how America and Russia can avoid some kind of conflict on this. Now, the Ukraine crisis goes back quite a ways. We could take this way back and look at Ukraine's not even strategic, but just historical, even spiritual connection to Russia. They speak the same language in many cases, or a very similar language. The Russian Empire has roots in Kiev. I mean, I could go on. The Ukraine was created, as it is today, was created by Khrushchev as a kind of act of charity. And in a, we could talk about the wider nation building campaign of the Soviet Union. They were promoting a lot of nationalisms all over the place. Ukraine was one of them. But it goes way back. Now, in terms of why is this a geopolitical question, this goes back to the Bush era, when it was announced that Ukraine's entrance into NATO is a possibility devoutly to be wished, something to that effect. Ukraine is, of course, not a member of NATO, but that would put NATO right at Russia's doorstep. Now, in 2008, there was a Bucharest conference in which it was announced no go by Russia. We will not allow Ukraine to be a member of NATO. Long before then, Russia was renting. In fact, they were paying a lease on military installations in Crimea. There were many efforts that were both organic and American funded. The Orange Revolution of 2004, and then 10 years later, the Maidan of 2014, for Ukraine to break away from Russia, maybe join the EU economic sphere as opposed to the Russian customs union, maybe join NATO. And again, Russia was not willing to fully invade Ukraine. They were not willing to fully, lay down the lumber and say no, but they did basically transform military installations in Crimea into what is part of a Russian sphere of influence. Now, Russia has a footprint inside Ukraine. So it is inherently a divided country. It's already a divided country, east and west, roughly. But it's now divided militarily. And so the notion of Ukraine's entrance into NATO is now pretty much off the table. How could you, according to NATO, which is it's Article 5 of NATO resolution, which is the Three Musketeers option, all for one for all. If one state is attacked, all states are attacked. This was a obviously Cold War coalition that is about confronting Russia. How could you offer NATO membership to a country in which the Russian military is stationed? I mean, that is just seemingly insane and just totally unworkable. We've had since 2014, we've had that status quo. And when I look at things now, I'm not predicting global catastrophe, but I do look at it and ask myself, how can they get out of this? How can they avoid some kind of hot conflict with talk like this and with actions like this? Many in the American media want to defend Ukraine. Some in the American media have even calling for preemptive invasions of Ukraine by the United States. Russia is amassing troops. Where does that go? Is Putin going to back down? Would he lose face? I mean, it is a real quandary. And it's hard for me to see how this, ends up in any other way but a new status quo. That something has to give here. But I don't know how this is going to unfold. But I will end my opening monologue there, and I will accept some requests, and we can talk about it. Okay. Roos, you have the floor first. You just jumped off. Okay. Guillaume Sutton, you have the floor. Still connecting. Okay. Knight, are you there? You have the floor. And you just jumped off. Salt, you have the floor.
Do you give any credence to the whole Azov battalion line and somewhat historical argument that because the Kievan Rus was never conquered by the Mongol hordes and that Russia was de facto ruled for about 600 years by the Golden Horde, that basically Ukraine is the dividing line between Asiatic despotism and true Europe?
I don't know. I mean, maybe there's something to that. I mean, I don't. I would say generally speaking, no, but there might be something to that. I mean, I do think that there is a strong divide between East and West. I mean, speaking as a pan-Europeanist, I would love the idea of a united Europe across the entire continent, but I also recognize reality, and I do think that there are very strong divides here. with the kind of, you know, more cosmopolitan St. Petersburg kind of leaning west and so on. There's been a kind of tug of war in Russia of going between east and west. But I definitely don't subscribe to like Russians aren't white or some just kind of nonsense like that. Um, I don't know.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I guess my last question. We all kind of agree, based on the terrain of Ukraine, that Afghanistan type of resistance wouldn't quite work out if Russia were to go in, which I don't think they will.
Hmm.
But do you see any credence to the type of ideological resistance, or do you think Westernism isn't as strong enough of a gumption for people to build off of to build like an IRA, like resistance in
So
Ukraine?
are you talking about resistance like resistance from the east towards Westernism,
No,
or are
I
you
mean more so in the case that Ukraine actually does go in. I mean, they would
Russia goes
fall.
into Ukraine?
Yeah,
Yeah.
everybody would agree that they'd fall relatively quickly. But the question is, would they be able to be presumably sucked back into Greater Slavdom and
Huh.
just kind of would those tensions eventually die down with a few hyper Western leaning people fleeing?
I
Because
think that
I think
might
everybody
happen.
agrees that we won't see anything like Afghanistan in Ukraine if Russia did go in. But could you see kind of like a Western IRA type of thing?
That's hard to imagine. I mean, you do have these groups like the Azov Battalion and others where you have kind of fanatical Nazis, and I do think that those people are marginalized, but um, you know, there of course this is another aspect of Russia which kind of bothers me. This kind of like Russian propaganda about, you know, Ukraine's just like a Nazi stronghold and we're refighting the Second World War, which is just total disinformation. But um, yeah, I mean, I think you probably would have some like crazed, uh, like actual literal Nazis in Ukraine fighting against that. I would imagine that like Western leaning people in Kiev would flee to the West and be welcomed with open arms, and it would kind of dissipate the problems.
Hey, well, thank you. Have a good day.
Sure. You too. Okay. Let's go to radar.
Thanks for the floor once again. I
Sure.
wrote down like a question here, just going to be brief. Like, so do you think the internal fascination or obsession of the United States with the Russian has some flavor of internal dynamics? And I'm just as a segue, how do you think common Americans see Russians, and would there be a willingness for Americans to fight Russians hypothetically? And last questions, aren't the Republicans or the Trump-leaning Republicans somewhat have an admiration for Putin and Russia in general?
Yes and no to kind of all of those questions. So there was a funny graph where I think it was the Washington Post or something. They mapped out whether you could place Ukraine on a map, and then they ask you whether you're eager for a conflict in Ukraine. And people who could not locate Ukraine on a map were more eager to invade. So it's kind of funny, but maybe even not surprising as well. Just total silliness. Um, in terms of, I mean, this is an interesting question because it's been my view, and I've said this in other spaces and elsewhere. I mean, I think that Joe Biden is managing a kind of imperial decline, and that has a lot of causes, but one of them is the fact that the population is not the population at 2000, of 2003. And, you know, again, I've also said this before. I am in my 40s. I can look back 20 years and I have a vivid memory of all this. In 2001 to about 2004, the amount of flag waving that you saw in relation to 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq was tremendous. You saw patriotism on, from like hipsters. I was actually living in New York City during 9/11, and there were like hipsters doing candlelight vigils and waving flags. I can't imagine that level of intensity being reached again. And a lot of that also has to do with the fact that the United States is a lot less white now than it was 20 years ago. It's changed demographically. People, that kind of, boomer flag waving is a very white thing. I think we're going to actually see less of it, for better and for worse, I guess. So I think it would be hard, very hard, if not impossible, for Joe Biden to whip up Americans into some kind of war fury in order to engage in a land war in Central Europe. I mean, that just seems almost impossible. Now, at the same time, a lot of people, I've heard this from basically dumb Republicans where they say, Putin's doing this because of Afghanistan. So because Biden completed the pullout of Afghanistan, we look weak. And so now Putin's taking advantage. This is kind of like a Crenshaw-like take. Well, the opposite, of course, is true, because now we have more resources to use in Eastern Europe. And we're not caught up in that endless quagmire, which Russia has a memory of being caught up in an endless quagmire in Afghanistan. Now, in terms of the Republicans, I think it can go either way, because, I've seen some clips from Tucker Carlson expressing, anti-war sentiments. Why are, basically isolationist sentiments. Why are we fighting over there? We don't have any strategic interest. We don't even know where that place is. Who cares? Let's worry about our own borders and not Russia's borders, et cetera, et cetera. That being said, you get a lot of sentiment going the other way. And I think Republicans are just so they're just so partisan and dumb that they will attack. They will, like, let's say this: if Russia invades Ukraine and Joe Biden does nothing outside of strong words and sanctions, they will basically start whining about who lost Ukraine, much like with Afghanistan. So when Trump was supporting a withdrawal from Afghanistan, these Republicans sounded like Pat Buchanan. They were like, well, this is good. He's a sound leader. He's a realist, whatever. And then when Biden actually completed the withdrawal from Afghanistan, they all flipped, including Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson supported the Iraq War, by the way. And they all said, we've lost Afghanistan. Why did you do this? How can we betray our soldiers and blah, blah, blah. So I could see, if Joe Biden plays the isolationist, I could see them attacking him for it. Now, what would happen if Biden, and again, I think this is a fairly remote possibility, but Biden engages in a war with Russia? Might they back him? Yes. Might they, for partisan reasons, become isolationist? Maybe. I'm not positive about that. But they don't, what I am positive about is that they don't have an actual coherent vision, and they kind of flow with the wind.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay. T. Chamberlain. T. Chamberlain. You have the floor.
Yeah. Thank you. I just wanted to ask you what you thought about the idea that the United States, the Iraq War. There's an idea out there that the Iraq War in 2003. There's a lot of people who believe in the conspiracies about 9/11, believe in conspiracies about all different types of things. And a lot of people feel like, well, if the U.S. government was able to pull off 9/11, there's certainly a lot of questions about it. How come we just didn't pull off like WMDs? And there's a school of thought out there that people think that was because that was the beginning of America's decline. And that was funded by, what they would call globalists today, I don't know, World Economic Forum or the New World Order or whatever. So I want to get your thought on that, what you thought about that theory, and that since 2003 was really the beginning of America's precipitous decline internationally, and that this is actually being set up, that we're actually being set up by intelligence agencies in conjunction with, again, this New World Order.
Well, I mean, you're just making a lot of assumptions. I mean, so what you just suggested was that the deep state did 9/11, but then by 2003, i.e., 2 years later, had declined to such a degree that it couldn't do WMDs. I mean,
No, no, more
that
like,
kind of a.
how did we pull off? Well, there's the idea that we did, if we were able to do
Well, I know, but
9/11,
you
how
have
come
to
we?
assume that going in, and I don't assume that. I don't assume that the deep state or the Bush and Cheney were behind 9/11. So I don't I'm willing to like countenance discussion of that, and I'm willing to kind of I do think that there was a lot more to the story than what we know.
Right.
Fair, but I don't just assume what you're assuming, and so it's hard for me to answer that question.
Okay, yeah, I guess I was just asking like what you thought about the idea of 2003 being the year that we could have, we easily could have made up WMDs, but we chose not to, and so it was
It is a
orchestrated that
curious
America's.
thing. It's actually kind of an argument against 9/11 truth. I mean,
Exactly, that's exactly it.
yeah. Okay. Let's Guillaume Sutton. Do you want to jump in?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Sure.
Hi, Richard. Thanks for having me in the
Hi.
space, especially on this topic. So, you questioned why this Caleb Maupin guy, why he's a socialist, but he's also he appears to be a mouthpiece for the Russian regime.
Yeah.
But I wanted to point out that being anti-war has been a long plank of, or a key part of the socialist platform for a long time. The Bolsheviks came to power because they opposed World War I. Their pitch was peace, land, and bread. And
Right.
if they had just tactically supported the war because it would lead to the Tsar losing credibility, I don't think they would have had credibility. The people wouldn't have followed them.
Right.
And secondly, opposing the Atlanticist world order, that is socialism, because all of Russia's allies, or at least all the socialist countries of the world, they have good relations with Russia. The reason that Russia is so demonized and attacked by like the Western media is because they nationalized their gas industry, and the oil and natural gas. So like the oil companies, they like operate as a cartel, but every barrel of oil that, say, China or Iran or Venezuela sells is a barrel of oil that like ExxonMobil or Shell Oil isn't able to sell. So they don't like having to negotiate with Russia. And so I think like having respect for like people's and nations' sovereignty, like that's a key tenet of socialism as a principle. Like respecting national self-determination, independence. I think, in fact, the Soviet Union's whole foreign policy, it was very anti-imperialist. They supported, independence movements all over the third world.
Yeah,
So
this just sounds like I agree with a lot of what you said, but this just sounds like propaganda at some level. I mean, Trotsky was the leader of the Red Army. I mean, they might take that line at certain points, and maybe that is a good line. I mean, look, if someone asked me, do you support a war with Russia, I would of course say no, and I would give you a lot of strategic reasons why it is not part of a vital national interest. But I'm also not going to lie to you and say that, well, if we do want kind of a new world order, then something like this is going to have to happen, to be honest. And to describe Soviet policy as not imperialistic, I mean, I'm sorry, that just sounds like you're spouting propaganda.
Well, I mean, it really is. Imperialism isn't well, the way Caleb used it, and I'm not shilling for Caleb either. I'm not like a mouthpiece for the Caleb regime. But when he says imperialism, he's talking about a system. He's not talking about like whenever a big country dominates a smaller country. I think imperialism, when like communists use that term, they're talking about like the system of like global finance, headquartered in New York or headquartered in Wall Street in London, like this banking oil cartel. That's what they're talking about. And Lenin, Vladimir Lenin, he actually wrote a pamphlet. It's called Imperialism: The Highest Stage of Capitalism, where he outlined the strategy that like
Yeah,
revolutionary
I know
to
that they have a critique of Anglo-American imperialism. I don't think imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, but putting that aside, I know they have a critique of that, and we might even agree with certain aspects of that. But all I'm saying is to describe the Soviet Union as non-imperialist is just absurd. Like it's a different type. You could even to make a distinction, like it's more of a territorial empire. It has a different system or something. But if you claim that they're anti-imperialist, it just sounds like you're spouting propaganda, to be honest. And
well,
I
I
mean,
mean,
right now, Russia, like this is all about empire. It is about a Russian sphere of influence. Now, it's the Russian sphere of influence is different than the American unipolar world, no question. But it is a sphere that is not just like a nation state or something like that. And this whole conflict is about will Ukraine have an opportunity to join NATO? And so, like, that's what it's about. The option to join NATO is what this is all about. And so it's all about empire.
okay, well, the Soviet Union, they nearly bankrupted themselves, building up their like constituent nations outside of the Russian core. So it was
Yeah,
like
but
they
why were
weren't
they doing that? All right,
they
this
weren't
just
in.
sounds like propaganda. All right,
Okay,
this is just absurd. I mean, come on, man. I mean,
well,
I almost find it an insult to the Soviet Union to say that it wasn't an empire.
okay, it was an empire. I agree, but it's not. It wasn't practicing. Hold on, it wasn't an imperialist power. It was an empire.
Well, we're
And I know
just
that.
using semantics here. It obviously had a different system to the Anglo-American system. Of course, I grant you that, but it's just a different version of empire. But like, let's call it what it is. I mean,
Maybe in the most abstract sense, but in reality, like it wasn't a capitalist country. It was a
I know
socialist country.
okay, yeah, it's not a capitalist country like the United States. Yes, now we can start talking about the definition of capitalism, but yeah, but just don't. We're trying to be objective here. We're not just like taking sides in the Cold War. I mean,
Well,
it's over, and I'm ambivalent about both sides.
yeah, I mean, I agree. I agree. But I'm just saying that Russia has to behave differently because of material reasons. I don't think it's because just like some mysterious like cultural thing that we could never understand. And it's like inherent and it's like magic soil just causes them to be different. I think it's economic and material. Like Russia has to they have to take the posture they take because they're on the back foot and it ends up pushing them into alliance with a bunch of socialist states and the Donetsk and Luhansk republics. Those are socialist uh, areas. I think that
Well,
their government
yeah.
is socialist, and
I mean,
Belarus.
I think that Russia, if the West had played things differently and maybe more smartly, the West could have worked with Russia against, quote, communist powers like China in particular. And that there are voices that want to do something like that. I don't think that like there's some. I mean, I was actually taken by my discussion last Wednesday, I believe, where it's kind of like Russia is absolutely alienated from the American-led order and is marginalized and kind of demonized. I mean, I think that's clear, and to a large degree, it's unfair. But that's why it is, as you say, on its back foot, and that's why it's like reaching out to these countries. Whereas I think a much smarter um, American diplomat, and maybe Biden has a little bit of Nixon in him, would be reaching out to Russia and like opposing the real strategic competitor of the future, which is China. But I don't think like Russia is, again, it's this like pure communal communistic society, and that's why it has, forays with Iran or something. I mean, I think it's being pushed into a corner, and I think it could go the other way.
Yeah, but this like the West reaching out to Russia, like I think that like the banks and oil companies, they wouldn't allow it because they don't want to have to actually respect their sovereignty and their right to sell oil on the market as they wish. So like because of our system, it's like we're just incapable of doing it. So like there would have to be some kind of revolution to make that possible. So that's why I think it is worth it to oppose, to talk about NATO expansion in Eastern Europe and to keep standing up for Russia against like Anglo-Atlantic attacks. Yeah, just because that would have to push us in that kind of direction, reorienting the economy like a revolution of sort. Does that make sense? Or am I rambling?
Yeah. No. Yeah. You've. Yeah. Okay. Let's go to. I'll get to Bardamu and Horatius soon. Let's go to Haniel.
Bruh. Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm just wondering. You were talking about Westernism and all of that, and it seems that your pan-Europeanism is inspired by Alain de Benoit and the pluralism and all of that. I wonder how you solve, which is inclusive of Russia, and I wonder how that school or you solve the sort of anti-Western spirit that Russia has. And let's use an example, Dostoevsky as an example of that, who basically condemned the entire quote unquote Western tradition, started with the rationalism of the Catholic Church, and then Protestantism, and then the Enlightenment. Dostoevsky seems to make it like a linear progression between those three things. So I'm just wondering how you solve that contradiction.
Maybe that's a nut that can't quite be cracked. I mean, I am a Westerner, and that is my background, and maybe that's a nut that just can't be cracked. Maybe we can't do that. I would say that Putin doesn't have any vision of anti-Westernism that isn't just purely tactical and kind of like understandably responding to being alienated from the American-led order. Like, I don't think there's an actual Dostoevskian vision coming out of Moscow. I don't think they have any vision whatsoever. And so in some ways, I mean, there is a nut that maybe can't be cracked, but I think also, like, as I was stressing at the beginning of the conversation, like, all of this stuff about like Russia being a bastion of either socialism or tradism or something, I just find a complete fantasy.
No, I agree with that, but I'm just okay.
Yeah.
But even in the whole practice of creating the Russian sphere of influence, you don't think there's a sort of like an underground current that can be explained as an opposition?
Well, how would you sum it up in essence? Like anti-rationalism or something? I mean, what?
No, I don't agree with the whole orthodox view of Western Christianity,
Yeah.
But I mean, I don't. It was just a question.
Yeah. No. Okay, that's fair enough. All right, so let's go to the retarded Rhodesian version 2. You have the floor.
Hey, Richard. I joined this space a little late, so I hope that someone didn't already ask this, but my question's pretty short. Boris Johnson said today, the BBC said that he was threatening to. He was basically just saying that in the event that Russia invades, then NATO will deploy forces, and then he also mentioned something about heavy economic sanctions. So basically, my question is: do you think that NATO deploying forces into Eastern Europe to cause what Boris Johnson described as would be a disastrous bloodshed situation? Do you think that's just posturing, and that the economic sanctions are really all that's going to come out of this, given that NATO is, I mean, it's kind of obsolete in a sense. It was like, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I mean, I hope he's just posturing, of course. But if what he says is true, then NATO is treating Ukraine as a member, even though it is not. I mean, there are no just vital strategic interest in Ukraine, and thus, going to war over Ukraine when it's not even a member, it's not signed this pact. That is just totally insane.
Well, in 1991, Ukrainian independence from the Soviet Union, the West, including the United States, promised Ukraine that if Ukraine destroyed, it's at the time, which at the time it had the third most nukes in the world,
Yeah.
that if Ukraine destroyed, then the West would back them up in case Russia invaded. So I think the West, United States of America, is obliged to put every pound of its weight toward the fight for free Ukraine. And I just want to say, the first guy, he was talking about how what was it? How Ukraine is a descendant of Kiev Rus, and Muscovy, or what you know as Russia, is a descendant of primarily Mongol hordes. That's completely true. In fact, it goes further back than that. Ukraine is the Or ethos. All white, so-called European, so-called Aryan, so-called Proto-European, whatever you want to say. All quote-unquote European peoples descend from Ukraine. Ukrainianism is the Or ethos. You guys made a Faustian deal with people. You guys will be destroyed. You must return to Ukrainianism. All right, that's all I had to say. Thank you.
All right.
Richard, I just have a quick follow-up.
Go ahead.
I just have a quick follow. Yeah, my only follow-up is so I agree that Ukraine has no geostrategic importance, and that NATO will be treating Ukraine as part of NATO if the West does deploy troops. And I know that Russia, like, people that think Russia is like this shred country is like ridiculous. They don't think in terms of like the West. I think Putin is sort of like a tactical realist. But what I'm asking is if Ukraine and broader Eastern Europe, including the Baltic states, if they become more entangled with NATO, EU, the America, just the Atlantic Alliance, do you think that, for lack of a better word, they will become paused, like America and the Western Europe?
Yeah. I mean, that's just
okay,
inevitable.
Yeah.
I mean,
I completely agree. That's why I'm almost. I hope that war doesn't happen.
Yeah.
I mean, you could say Russia is more paused. I think Russian is the most rapidly dying ethos on the planet. I mean, they tend towards death. They worship death. I mean, even more so than when Americans.
Let's hold on here. All right.
I don't know what that was about, but
I am being fairly critical towards Russia and Putin, but you're taking things a bit over the top here. I mean, we're welcome to any Russian who wants to join this conversation. I am not hostile towards Russia, and I simply do have a more of a skeptical view of Russia, maybe, than some, and I probably have a more pro-Russian, sympathetic towards Russian view than really shrill people in the media. But let's just cool it with the anti-Russian remarks a bit. All right. I mean, I let you go, and you got that stuff off your chest, and it's sincerely expressed. But let's just not go over the top. All right, you understand? That sounds good. All right.
That's fine. I was a longtime fan of yours. Now a longtime hater, but now I'm more so a fan, especially relative to the rest of the dissent. Right. So.
Okay. Good. Well, if I'm not annoying you, then I'm not doing my job, I guess. Okay, Bartomeu, do you want to jump in, and then I'll get to some other people.
Yes. Someone brought up. Do you guys actually want to hear the Soviet definition of just war? This
Sure.
comes from a Soviet defector called Wolfgang Leonhard. This is from his book. This is from the 1930s. This is from a university lecturer. The lecturer had been expounding the distinction between a just and unjust war. A just war could never be a war of conquest, but only a war of liberation, either to protect a people against external attacks or against attempts to keep them under subjection. Examples were the liberations of a people from the enslavement of capitalism or of colonies from the yoke of imperialism. Unjust war, on the contrary, were the wars of aggression and conquest in which object was to overrun foreign countries and enslave foreign people. He analyzed all the various well-known wars of history and ended his lectures by pointing out that it was the duty of Marxist-Leninists to analyze every particular war and then formulate their attitudes toward the war in question. So I thought that was relevant when people were talking about what the Soviets, if the Soviets, their attitude towards peace and imperialism and war and such. So
yeah. I mean, obviously, I take all of that with a grain of salt, to say the least. It strikes me, just war theory strikes me as sentimental nonsense. A great war can justify any cause. The words
yes,
of Zarathustra.
Yes, it is interesting because it quite clearly says that it is not a pacifist. Marxist-Leninism is not pacifist. It is about that
liberating.
You should take your exactly.
Although I'm not sure that Ukraine would feel liberated. I think there is a lot of genuine sentiment in the East that would prefer to be part of the Russian custom union. They benefit from it materially and immediately, and they speak Russian. They look towards Russia, etc. But that is interesting and part of the discussion. All right, Horatius, would you like to jump in? Or have you already spoken? No, you haven't yet. You can jump in.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think your points on the Republicans being just extremely dumb and inconsistent on this is just a major disappointment because hang on a second. What's the name of the river that runs through Ukraine, right to the center?
It's the Dnieper.
The what?
The Dnieper. The Dnieper is the name.
Yes. I thought you said Danube for a second. My apologies.
No, it's my accent. My accent. It's the Dnieper River.
Okay. Yes, thank you. The Dnieper River, they're your generic boilerplate boomer Republican, and is basically thinking to themselves that their frontier lies on the Dnieper River. And while although many of them have started to kind of see that the U.S. empire isn't really on their side, they're still supporting it.
Yeah.
And how much more can it take? Because they don't like the political theology. They have a hard time articulating all this stuff. They don't like its political theology, the quote-unquote wokeness, which has been around for a long time, yet they still are supporting they don't like the empire sort of metaphysically, but they do like it, I don't want to say materially, but they'll support its material actions. And how much longer is that going to be? Because one part of me says, oh, it's just people they're listening to, like Sean Hannity, Ben Shapiro, Mark Levin, etc. Mm-hmm. The other part of me says that they're just going to believe all of this until the day that they die, and they're not going to take it away.
I think it's the latter because it's, there's always been an ambiguity with America first. Like, what do you mean by America first? What does that mean? Now, I think out of the mouth of Trump, it did seem to mean nationalism in 2016, like our industries, our border, our people, let's educate our people first. Let's not bring in all these foreigners. Let's secure the borders, etc. But America hasn't really meant that. It's always been kind of a little bit schizo or kind of double-sided. Like America has meant like rolling back the Soviet Union or spreading our culture far and wide and winning these international wars. Because America's never lost a war. I don't know if you ever heard that. But it has been expansive and liberationist. And a lot of those conservatives might agree
Spencer,
with that Soviet ideology of a just war is when you liberate a people from oppression or something. That's part of the American worldview. And so I think it's hard to extract these things. And so it's this weird thing. I mean, I remember just seeing something on Twitter where this just kind of obvious fraud, he's a Teal acolyte named Blake Masters, is running for Senate, I believe, in Arizona. And he's saying like, there's the Americanist and then the globalist, and we're against it. Well, the Americans are the globalists, It's just a weird conception, and I don't think they can kind of get themselves out of it.
I think that, a lot of this comes with two things. You think of like a mid-20th century Norman Rockwell painting.
Yeah.
And many of these people think that I can have the mid-20th century Norman Rockwell painting, which basically depicts a certain time and place of American culture, which had, have a lot of good sentimentalities about it, but was the mindset not of the elites, but of the general population. And that generation, and a few generations afterwards, still see that. They think, oh, I can have the Norman Rockwell America, yet at the same time, we can play empire around the world, and there's not going to be any consequences at all. And so,
right.
Again, it's just a lack of understanding that a lot of them just don't seem to understand that, again, like quote unquote wokeness, that is the U.S. empire. That is what it is. And until they are willing to criticize the U.S. empire, until like, imagine if like Donald Trump, like if he runs in 2024, imagine if he ran and said that the United States had become an evil empire. Okay, they need to be. I'm just saying, like they needed to be slapped in the face with that, because unless that they are, they're not going to understand.
Well, also, so much of their economic, stability or the middle class lifestyle is also dependent upon the overseas empire, and I don't think they're really willing to undo that. Even though, yes, this is kind of flipped over into something that really harms them, where they do want like a 9-to-5 job in a factory, or many of them do want that. And so they don't like offshoring and so on. But then, they couldn't buy the stuff that they buy without the kind of chimerica global arrangement as well. So it's very complicated. And they don't want to give up anything, and they kind of want to have it all. I mean, let's say that Putin moves his forces into Ukraine, and Joe Biden, because he has a little bit of Nixon in him, and because he just doesn't want to go to war, he recognizes that a land war in Central Europe would be catastrophic. He might just not do anything outside of sanctions. And in 2024, Republicans, including Trump, are going to be running on who lost Ukraine. Much like now, they're talking about impeaching Joe Biden on the basis of who lost Afghanistan.
Yeah, this is a big issue. Credit where credit is due, at least for the quote unquote, I don't want to say left, but for the, I don't want to say establishment, might not be the best term either, but when it comes to like Bill Kristol per se, or David Frum, when it comes to their views on foreign policy, you may not like them, but they are consistent.
Yes.
With your Marjorie Taylor Greenes, even your Ted Cruz's, and what have you, there is just like no consistency. It's just, how do I one up my opponent?
Yes.
And, sure, if you're going to change your mind on like a domestic policy issue because you see it as more practical, that's certainly commendable. However, this is just red versus blue bullshit, and it's going to get in the way from actual considerations on how to deal with a foreign power such as Russia.
And even the Tucker line of like, we can't have transsexuals in the military because how could we defeat Russia with a bunch of transsexual? Like that's almost the implication of that kind of thinking, is that we're not going to be strong enough to stride the world like a colossus as we did in my youth by like concern trolling the military. So yeah, I don't think these people can be brought around to it. And opposing the American empire, on some level you are opposing America itself. And
yes,
so they can't do that. I mean, they are conservatives. They can't, like, that is a radical notion where you're like, why don't we just tip this thing over the edge? Like, why don't you go to war with Russia, you morons? Because that's the only way that would bring about a new status quo, is a geopolitical catastrophe.
Yeah, and like detaching them from the empire, sort of like psychologically detaching them from it. I mean, you'd first have to get them to say that Reagan was a scam.
Yeah,
that's not gonna. I don't imagine that happening. My only hope is that the sort of the ideology of the empire just shows itself to be crazier and crazier, that they become increasingly disillusioned. However, they might not be able to understand that the recent ideological underpinnings that it has shown over the past decade is not a fluke, but is like a century in the making. And that this thing has actually been around for quite a long time. But anyway, good points. I'll let somebody else speak.
Yeah. I just don't think that this is going to be, I don't think the empire is going to be ended because conservatives have been like given the right talking points. I don't think they are willing or able to undergo the kind of like mental transformation that would require that. And also, I don't think that's how empires really end. I think it's gonna end by its own contradictions. I mean, one thing I would say, changing the demographics and bringing in many people from around the world, are they going to be willing to face off against Russia? That just strikes me as highly doubtful,
Well,
so it's this weird, this unintended consequence of America's like generosity and globality is that it won't be able to fight these wars. I think everything happens in that kind of dialectical fashion.
Yeah, I understand. Although I would say, if the conservatives stop enlisting in the military, and they make up the vast supermajority of the combat units, I think that would sort of send a message. At least it would send shockwaves. I don't know what the long-term effects would be.
Yeah.
But again, that's just against their nature. They're not. I don't.
Right.
No one's leading them against that and is doing it in a way that is consistent and in a way that is, all encompassing. Because the Republican Party just has a lot of stupid leaders.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, you're not offending me. Okay. Perseus, do you want to jump in?
Yes, thank you, and good evening, Richard.
Good evening.
I want to reiterate a point I made on a previous space of yours, and you've kind of already answered it, but and it's probably going to be a very unpopular opinion, but I think a U.S.-Russian war could potentially be bad for NATO. It could be bad for Ukraine. It could be bad for Russia and American hegemony. But I think overall, it could potentially be very healthy for America culturally and socially. And that is because it's undeniable that we're sort of stuck in this whirlwind of absurdity, whether it's Black Lives Matter, LGBTQ, or these sort of incessant debates over abortion and gun rights. I think that the national talking points, the national narrative, and the people overall haven't necessarily faced a legitimate challenge. And I think that in the same sort of way that you would want, maybe as like
maybe it might be bad parenting tip, but sometimes as a parent, you kind of have to let your kid fight someone, even if they're going to lose, just so they can kind of learn a life lesson, so they can kind of just toughen up. It's sort of a weird passage into masculinity. And I think that we as a society have just been in this cultural lull for so long that I don't really know how we're going to get out of it unless we sort of drag and claw ourselves. And if that even means dragging all of these minorities and the gay community into war, I don't know how else we will get out of this. And I think that Russia sort of fits that opponent that we need, that the sort of equally matched opponent, someone who you can't really predict. You can't just go in there expecting to win. And I think that as a society, we need that sort of challenge. Otherwise, we're going to just be debating and discussing the same topics. I don't know how much more race riots and transsexual bathrooms discussions we can really have. I don't
Well,
know
I
if
agree. Also, what is I mean, to sum up what you're saying, like, what's the one way to end polarization? A good old fashioned war. That's the only way to get out of it. And maybe, although I doubt Biden would broach this, or people would say this openly, but I mean, if I don't think his approval rating is actually all that bad, and losing the midterms in your first term is not terribly unusual. It's actually the norm. But, do you want to be a national leader? I mean, something like a war with Russia would go a long way towards that. And I know this is entirely cynical, like amoral talk, but is it wrong? I mean, it's like this would bring the country together like nothing else can.
Yeah, and I think if you go back and look at like the 2003, 2004 anti-war protests, even then, even amongst the liberals, there was still a support the troops sentiment. So
Yeah.
they would never go fully anti-military. It was more of a policy, argument against Bush.
Yeah.
And now a lot of those liberals are now taking pictures with Bush and shaking his hands and, shaking Dick Cheney's hands like he's some hero. So I don't know how, valiant they are in their anti-war cause either. I think what these people need is a larger narrative that can override the current national narratives that will sort of, I don't know necessarily if it's going to make Americans kumbaya, but I think at the least it could potentially make Americans look at each other differently. Even
Yes.
and I would even go as far as saying losing to Russia may even be good, because it makes everyone sort of take a step back, that we're not the universe, we're not the center of the world, or to a certain degree we are, but at the same time that's the position we have to fight to maintain. We have to sort of work together to maintain, and that conversation isn't necessarily happening because everyone is in the sort of virtual reality fantasy land in which they're all living their own sort of online fantasies. And I think that this is more socially damaging to Americans long term, continuing the status quo.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think you need to say any more. I definitely see your point. Okay, let's move on to Adolf. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Once again, I'm a big fan of your spaces, and I hope you keep doing them.
Thanks.
Yeah, sure. So you can tell me if this is a stupid question, and we can just move on. I don't want to waste time. What is it that I'm a little bit confused why Russia actually wants Ukraine? Not because it wouldn't be nice to have, but it just feels like there's a lot at stake for Russia to go for Ukraine, and Putin is not too old, but he's getting older, and he's gonna die in office, and it just seems like this is very bad, and I don't know what they get out of it. So would you mind explaining
Well,
what
I mean,
the
I think I already, talked about that. I mean, it is about the option of Ukraine joining NATO, and that would be a NATO alliance that is foundationally directed against Moscow on Russian borders. I mean, that's just in their minds too close. It's like there is a red line in the sand that America cannot cross, and that's what it's about. Now, I do think that they do have some, historical connection with Ukraine, of course, but yeah, I mean, it is fundamentally geostrategic, and that is the overriding motivation for Russia. But I mean, I think the more important question is, what is America's interest there?
That's fair. And then,
Yeah.
sorry, one quick question. Does this goal of Ukraine and not wanting NATO to get too close, does that change after Putin, I don't know, leaves
No,
office?
I don't think it would. No,
Okay.
I think that is like built into their imperial DNA.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Let's go. Obvious. Obvious sock puppet. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, g'day, Richard. How you doing? Yeah, I've been listening. Yeah, g'day. Yeah, I've been listening for a little bit, and yeah, you've had some really nice questions from a lot of people here. There's a previous guy who was mentioning about Russia and thing there. It just recalled me. I think I've read it's either Kissinger's book or Nixon's book. I'm not sure which one it was, but he's recalling the 1970s when they were opening up to China. And there's a quote by Nixon or Kissinger, and he's explaining to someone that China has the potential to overtake America industrially and politically and things like that. And the quote explicitly says that Nixon wanted to pivot to Russia before that happened, and would have been after the Cold War, in a future end to the Cold War. So yeah, it was just interesting to hear your take that it could have been done in the 90s. It could have been done in the 90s. That America could have knocked off China, locked all the industry out of China, and moved to Russia and made Russia where everyone makes their cheap shit. But
well, maybe
it didn't happen.
I didn't quite say that, but I take your point. I mean, I think at the very least, the Chimerica arrangement is absolutely political at its core. I mean, it's economic, but politics comes first. And what I was saying is that a hard-headed realist could view China as the rising power and as like the real strategic competitor, and then said to himself, we really need an outreach to Russia. Like, let's overcome the hard feelings from the Cold War. Let's kind of build up a big block of countries that are really friendly with us. Let's rethink NATO, maybe get rid of NATO, or something. Let's have NATO.
Do you think
let's
Biden
have
can
Russia
do that?
join NATO. I think Biden could do that. Yeah, because Biden, because he's so old, he kind of has like a memory of the Cold War. I mean, Biden, has spoken with Soviet dignitaries. Biden kind of knows how the game's played. Biden doesn't, engage in Twitter diplomacy. Biden will go talk to people. He knows that you have to keep diplomacy quiet, that a lot happens behind closed doors, and so on. I mean, he could do something like this. I mean, I think even Hillary Clinton, at least ostensibly, was gesturing towards something like that with the whole reset button that she was trying to press with Medvedev back in the Obama administration. So, I mean, this has always been an option. And I think after kind of by the second Obama administration, it was all just let's alienate Russia and get into this big cultural war battle with Russia.
What would America have to offer Russia at this point that China couldn't give?
Well, I think saying Ukraine is yours would go a long way. I mean, rethinking NATO or something. I mean, that's an interesting. I mean, NATO does have a bit of an identity crisis. What is it? Why is NATO? Is a good question right now.
Yeah, well, I know Putin proposed entering NATO in the late 90s, early 2000s at some point.
Yeah.
And that got shut down quickly.
Yeah.
So, I see where your point is, but if you gave Russia Ukraine, it's like taking something away halfway and giving it back to someone. Like, for full intents and purposes, most of Eastern Europe was Russia until very, very recently within our lifespan. So it's for me, even if Russia got Ukraine back, it's like, well, we just got 1/10 of what we had 30 years ago.
Yeah.
But anyway.
All right. Let's go to Brendan. Do you want to jump in?
Hi, Richard.
Hey.
I was thinking about what you said once about how coronavirus was Trump's big miss. He could have made it himself into a hero, and instead he just shrugged it off and lost his election. I'm thinking, well, this might be Biden's opportunity to look like a hero, and that with the midterms coming up and polarization just making half of the country unforgivably stupid. I mean, they're chanting, "Let's go, Brandon," every time Biden opens his mouth.
Yeah.
I think maybe if Biden uses nationalism against Russia, it would break the polarization. It would convince more Americans to also fight the coronavirus. He could tie in fighting the virus with, it sounds horrible, but he could tie in fighting the coronavirus with fighting Russia. He could somehow tie together. And also, he is the leader of the so-called free world. He kind of has an obligation to offer up some sort of fight, because it's been a long time since our country killed soldiers from another empire. I think Biden, if he wants to prove that he believes NATO is worth something, if Macron wants to prove that he cares about the EU project, if the White House wants to pretend that they care about the free world, then they should all make a coalition and be willing to have a ground war in Ukraine, but with they also need to offer an alternative to Putin. So if I was Biden, I would tell him, okay, yes, I'm okay with using MOABs on your soldiers. I'm okay with just getting a whole bunch of people killed. I'm 78. I don't care. Let's do it. But I would also say, on the other hand, I could also promise never to make Ukraine a NATO country unless both Ukraine and Russia wanted to join NATO. And he could also say, and I'm willing to change the objectives of NATO from being anti-Russia to working with Russia to do more important projects like keeping the Middle East stable and North Africa stable to stop illegal immigrants from invading Europe and Russia. And that would help.
Yes. This is
China.
the kind of creativity that is needed. And yes, I know that America isn't what it was and Europe is old and whatever, but like, imagine just the prospect of a united military alliance for the white world.
Yes, this is an opportunity to make it happen if Biden gets the idea for it.
Yeah. And I don't know. It would just be like overcoming these differences, which the differences are real, of course, but overcoming them in some way, overcoming polarization, just allowing the conservatives just to seem petty and backward and stupid by just ranting about polarization and moving past it. I mean, I think it would be a bold move. And Biden, I mean, it wouldn't just be about like going along with the war hawks. It would be about, because they don't want to ever allow, Russia anywhere, and they want war all over the place. But it would be a really bold gesture that would be pushing somewhere. And yeah, I mean, I don't know if he has that in him, but that would be absolutely creative.
I think that if he did come up with this idea or hear about it, he could deliver it to the American public before he does anything with Russia. That would get everyone in the news worldwide talking about it. He could just put it in public and drop it on everyone's heads.
Yeah.
But that's how you stop something like this from happening. You have to promise an actual fight, but then add something greater than what the enemy was looking for previously. You have to offer them something that they would want to take.
Yes. I totally agree. I totally endorse that. Okay. Let's do, I'll just go in a little bit. So affiliated, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of touch on the last couple points. I feel like, in my opinion, it seems like Biden is reaching, trying to deflect or maybe even sidetrack the American people in any way that he can, with the primaries coming up and with how terrible just the administration has been so far. I mean, we were sold on the great unifier, the one who was going to bring us together, the one that was going to stop, the chaos from the last regime. And it seems like on all levels, it's been a complete disaster. He's losing, touch with the citizens of the United States. He's pretty much turned citizens against each other. And I just feel like this is his maybe last hope to kind of gain some of those numbers back. 70 to 80% of the country right
This
now.
just sounds like Republican propaganda that I'm hearing right now, because I mean,
I'm not
you
a
could say
Republican.
all of that about Donald Trump in
Well,
spades.
we'll say that then. I mean, I have no problem with that. What I'm saying is, in reality, if there's anything he's done that's good or awesome, please be obliged to say it, because I haven't seen nothing but further problems. But that's not my point.
I don't.
My
Well, I
point
think
was,
the withdrawal of Afghanistan was actually pretty good and brave, but
I think it was terrible.
Well,
Terrible.
okay, that's a subject for a different space. But
Yeah.
At the same time, no, I more or less agree with you that it's been a pretty lackluster year. But I mean, we live in a declining country. Keep that
Oh,
in
yeah,
mind.
yeah.
Right? He's not going to like invent a new flavor of ice cream and everyone's going to go crazy.
Well, no, but it's kind of like he's doing the opposite of what we were sold on when he was, in the basement for the campaign. I didn't hear any of that coming out now, what we were sold on. It's
Well,
almost
he
the
just
opposite.
promised back to normalcy.
Right, and is it that?
He's
Are we
delivered on
anywhere?
that.
Are we back to normalcy? This doesn't seem
Yes, we
normal.
are.
Well,
Yeah,
okay,
this is
so
normal.
so to me, it seems like this is anything to kind of, like I said, get the subject back into his favor. We aren't ready right now to go to war with any country whatsoever. Look at the problems we're having in our own country with the borders, with just the chaos. I would rather him try to focus on our country and our citizens more, because there's things going on right now that would not leave us prepared to fight that kind of. Why would we risk that for someone who's failed so bad in foreign policy? You got 30 years of witnessing how he failed in foreign policy, yet we're ready to send our children over there to get killed for someone else's issues. I feel like this is something we're not ready for and we don't need.
Okay, I'm hearing a lot of GOP propaganda.
You promised you were 30 years ago.
What? Okay.
No, just 30 years ago, you guys promised that you would send your troops over.
Right. There's a lot of promises.
Let's do this. Let's do Polly Calhoun. You have the floor.
Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening.
I agree that that war is a real relationship saver. But I think a lot of people who are defending Russia right now, or not even defending outright, but trying to change the narrative to oh well, how would you feel, are forgetting exactly who Putin's Russia is. I mean, this is a guy who, if you wanted to move out and you say move to England, you and your daughter might get poisoned several years later by Putin's Russia. They are aligned with Iran. They at least do exercises with them. And we can't kid ourselves that anyone who does that kind of work with Iran is workable for us. Yeah, and
Yeah,
also
but
like
in the words of Donald Trump, are we saints exactly? Do you know how many people we killed in Iraq over the past 20 years? Something like 1 million people. You know that those liberals, those good bleeding heart liberals you've heard about, how many children they starved in Iraq? Do you know how many children are born with massive, terrible birth defects or live a few years and end up dying of hunger in Yemen right now? I mean, we're not angels. And I agree. Putin, is he a bit of a thug? Is there just kind of a more brutal quality to Russia? Of course, I agree with that. But do we want to therefore say that Americans are angels? No.
Well, I'm not saying Americans are angels. They certainly are not. But we maintain some degree, as weak as it is, of separation from atrocities, whereas Putin himself directly commits them or has
Right.
them done. So there is a significant difference there in that small detail. There also, I think this would be different, and I'm not saying let's rush over there by any means. We need to actually not jump into things as we have been doing, but they are not lined up. It is not they're worried about NATO, so they are, protecting themselves. They're not on that side of the border only, They are in Ukraine. They are putting people in Belarus. Those are threats, It's kind of like they've already taken the first swing. But again, they shouldn't rush into it.
Yeah.
A little more inside baseball. So with Putin's oligarchy, do you think if they you said you've been to Russia, you seem to know quite a bit about it. If, say, an Oleg Deripaska was saying, I absolutely don't want us to draw this kind of attention, let's let it go for now. How many of those, or if that even happened, do you think Putin would back down?
Okay, explain the situation you're proposing a little bit in a little more detail.
Well, his oligarchs who run the show a lot. If they were to say, this is drawing too much on us, we are individually sanctioned enough as it is.
We can't take more of this. Yeah.
And we just,
okay. I get it. I don't know, because amassing 100,000 troops and then withdrawing them without gaining anything, I think would be a face losing effort on Putin's part. So would he be willing to do that? I'm not sure. I think I think there might be a way to diffuse the whole situation by kind of letting Putin declare victory at home in some way. Like, basically announcing that, well, we'll revisit the NATO issue in 10 years or something. Just kind of kicking the can down the road, as politicians often do. That would be one way of diffusing the bomb and so on. I would much prefer what we were talking about 10 minutes ago, just some kind of bold, strategic, imaginative solution, like bringing Russia into NATO or something. But again, I don't think Putin would do that. Unfortunately, I think he would see that it would be almost a little too visionary for him. I think he would see that as losing. But yeah, I could see a way of diffusing this bomb, definitely. And I think Biden's he's a skilled operator. I imagine that's what's going to happen. But as I said at the opening of this, it's like 95-5 or something like that. 95, there's going to be some way to diffuse the situation, but 5%, I almost see them kind of sleepwalking into some kind of catastrophe. Bartolome, you want to jump in on this issue?
Yes, I'm surprised no one brought this up, but I've seen people who have said that 100,000 troops is not enough to conquer even the part of Ukraine east of that river, who I can't pronounce. So I do think they use this mostly as like they did last year in March or April. They do this as a way to leverage in the negotiations, where they can say like, "Oh, we remove these troops if you do some concessions." I think that if there were to be a war between Russia and Ukraine, I think that would have happened in 2014, and all the people in charge of Russia now were in charge back then too. So I don't think I think they're just doing this to have a leverage, to have a when they go to the negotiation tables to say something, maybe something about Donbas, that the Ukrainians should stop shelling that place, those poor miners. Yeah, I don't think there will be an invasion.
Yeah, I think that's sound. Okay, who have I not gotten to? Guess I can let a lot of these people in. All right, let's try to speed up the questions. Okay, Guillaume, you want to jump in real quick? You've already spoken, so keep it concise.
Yeah, I do want to say something. Thanks for letting me back on, Richard. So is Russia an oligarchy, or is Russia like this? Is it anti-oligarch? Because it seems like Putin goes after people that could threaten him, right? Which would be other like powerful people. So it seems like there's less of an oligarchy in Russia than in the West. Like there's a lot more powerful people in the West that have control over the government, and it's not openly acknowledged. They have like outsized influence, and it's not openly acknowledged.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a lot of oligarchies around the world. I mean, you're playing the same game that you were playing before of like, well, Russia's not an empire or something. I mean, it's clearly a different type of
Well, I mean, it is an empire, but it's not imperialist. At least the way that like when communists say like they're anti-imperialist, so they'll align with the Islamic Republic of Iran or the Ansarullah movement in Yemen, or who else? The Ethiopian government against what they call imperialist aggression, which would be the Wall Street and then the London like banking and oil cartels. But
yeah, we don't let JP Morgan openly slaughter people for our own gain. There's a big difference.
Well, I mean, we kind of do. That's what the U.S. military does. They do kill people for JP Morgan. To not being hyperbolic, but like that is what it does. And you said
you've had the military in your neighborhood lately, then?
Well, the neighborhood. I mean, the military is in other people's neighborhoods. Yeah, all around the world. So, and killing them too with our drone assassination program. That's a lot more thuggish and brutal than anything scary, toxic, masculine Putin has ever done. The American oligarchy, and it is an oligarchy, but the difference is that in other countries, it's acknowledged who's in charge. You know who's in charge. In America, it's that people can just deny that they have any responsibility. They can deny that they are the elite, so people don't hold them accountable. So we're over here in America really holding Putin accountable, even though he doesn't govern our country. So we're really concerned with what he does, but there's a lot less criticism of what America is currently doing, which is I think it's really destructive. And this other guest, she said that there's people being pro-Russia in the space. Who? It seems like everybody here is like super skeptical, I guess, for lack of a better.
Yeah, well, I've been waiting for pro-Russian voices. One thing that I have noticed is a disconnect, at least in my audience, really long term, in which I don't reach Russians. I remember looking. This was like 8 years ago. I remember looking at people who were listening to my podcast, and I would have like 8% of podcast listeners from Sweden or something, which is pretty remarkable. Most of them were from the United States, a lot from Britain, but you'd have like a lot of people from Scandinavia, relatively speaking. And then you'd have like no Russians. There'd be more Chinese listeners than Russians, probably expats. But it's just, it actually is pretty remarkable that I don't think there's enough communication, among dissident thinkers, if you could say, but Russia. I mean, I would be more than happy to give someone who's pro-Russia the floor, because this is an open forum, and as you can tell, I'm kind of skeptical of both sides. But yeah, I don't know if anyone like that is here outside
I
of
really
you.
wish. Yeah, I really wish we did have a Russian come talk because the last time you had a space about that addressed this topic, there was like a lot of like angry like Baltic people in there. So which I don't think they're very neutral.
One thing, we are doing this in the evening in the United States, so this is late night or very early.
Yeah,
over
it's
in Europe and
it's like
that might be have an effect.
It's like their time zone. I know Yekaterinburg is it's like the exact opposite time zone as say Los Angeles, but so yeah, that might be part of it.
Yeah. Okay. Who hasn't spoken? Oh, Unreconstructed. You've been there for a little while. Do you want to speak? Unreconstructed, you have the floor.
Yeah, hello?
Hey.
Yeah, I would like to say that I'm pretty also hey Rich. I'm pretty skeptical if this whole thing is even like a real conflict. For me, the political calculus, and I think Bard spoke on this a little bit, just doesn't make sense. For like, why would Russia invade? Invade with when they got the entire world's attention, like all this posturing and we're gonna invade. I think there was a news story like Biden is deploying like I don't know maybe brigades worth of troops to Ukraine, and it will only ramp up if it looks like an invasion is actually imminent, or it seems that way. The political calculus just doesn't make any sense to me. I cannot see why Russia would get the world's attention before invading. I mean, the fact that we're even having this discussion means that they're probably not going to invade. Like, Putin's not an idiot. Why would he broadcast to the entire world we're about to make this huge geopolitical move? Do you have any like? I'm sorry, Mr.
I agree, but like an invasion is a very difficult thing. I mean, you're going to have to amass troops at some level and mobilize them. So you can't just spring it on people. Now, there was was it 2012? There was the conflict. Was it 2008? 2012, was it 2008 that there was the conflict with Georgia? I'm getting my years.
2008.
And that occurred during the Olympics. So, yeah, it's, I don't know. The Winter Olympics are coming up. Buckle your seatbelts. Okay, Keith, would you like to speak?
Hey, Richard, can you hear me all right?
Hey, yes.
I think it's great to speak with you. I just want to get a little bit of your perspective sort of on Europe's, Western Europe, largely their relationship to NATO and Americanism. I mean, as we see, Europe really doesn't exactly see eye to eye with America on a lot of things. I mean, you see just generally the French don't really feel respected in their perspectives being heard whenever a decision gets made. You see Germany up to all kind of shenanigans where they're sort of like deracinated politically, but they're constantly pushing back. As far as you see how they're like blocking weapon shipments and their equipment going to Ukraine, but they're still like the biggest like arms like exporters in Europe with this massive economy. And I just really see Europe just maintaining this sort of dying with America, where they're just sort of happy with what's going on, or at least the elite in these countries are just happy to go along with what they're getting in the status quo. And it seems like they're just going to follow sort of the US into sort of the dustbin of history as the US loses its ability to sort of project power and just overall on the world stage. I mean, as you see in Ukraine, they're already admitting that like they can't stop Putin. So they're going to, you saw that like policy paper where they're saying that they're just going to fund an insurgency behind the lines, like after Putin steamrolls. So I just want to get your broad perspective on how you see like Europe in the immediate and even the near far future.
Well, that's a really big question. I mean,
yeah, just very broadly.
Well, I mean, how I see Europe in the near future. I mean, this is just a huge question. I mean, to bring it up to something tangible. I mean, there is this issue. I mean, NATO is obviously an anti-Soviet alliance that has been continued and is now anti-Russian. There is the EU, which has a different origin story. It does have a post-war origin story, but it is a different type of entity. It's based on customs. It's an economic entity, oil, steel and coal alliance at its origins. Can those pieces how do those pieces fit together? I mean, I think that's an interesting question because you can't separate them. I mean, looking at these polls from Ukraine, I mean, the big things are: do you want to be part of the Russian customs union, or do you want to join the European Economic Union? Do you, that tracks just exactly with whether you are, pro West and NATO and America or pro Russia. So I don't know. I mean, I think it's going to take a really creative and visionary leader to kind of bring these things together. Might there be a time when NATO kind of starts to almost merge with the EU? And so something that started as an American-led, Europe's in rubble. There's an American-led alliance against the Soviet Union. Does it actually kind of morph into a European army? I think that's an interesting kind of way of creatively thinking about this. But anyway, let's go to Yo-Yo Ma.
Hi, Richard.
Hey.
So I wanted to push back against this idea I've heard a couple times on here regarding this idea that going to war would somehow decrease polarization. I think people are really underestimating the level of polarization we have here. I mean, like the lessons of the last wars we've been involved in are not that it somehow brings a nation together. I mean, maybe in the wake of 9/11, we were together, but people seem to forget all of the George Bush is a fascist and all the F Bush t-shirts and comparing him to Hitler. Like, we would just have that repeated over again. So I just wanted people to have not such rose-tinted glasses about the past. Okay.
Yes and no, because I mean, yeah, of course. Look, I remember that vividly. I was just out of college, and but I mean, keep in mind the entire mainstream media was on Bush's side at that point, and most of the public supported that war. Clearly, now there was an anti-war movement, no question. I was in my own small way a part of that anti-war movement, but the nation was unified tremendously. And I think the way that I would frame it would be like, isn't it amazing the level at which conservatives hated Barack Obama or hated Joe Biden? And there's not any kind of catastrophe. Like, what did Obama do to these people? In his final term, particularly, where he did almost nothing. Why do they think he's the devil when he's just not accomplishing anything, good or bad? And
right.
I think that's kind of a better question. I mean, I do genuinely and generally believe that a war is a unifying cause. Like, I think if anything could break polarization, which just seems to ratchet up every day, it would be something like that. But we were a lot less polarized in 2004. I mean, there's no question. We were a lot less polarized immediately after 9/11. And we were kind of
I think there's been a trajectory.
Yeah.
There's been a kind of trajectory of us kind of downsliding and having more and more polarization with each passing, foreign policy failure, with each economic crisis internally. So the idea that like a war could bring us together makes sense if it was a war that we could win, if it was a war that there was some kind of reasonable objective that people could care about. But, fighting Russia and Ukraine is not that kind of war.
Yeah, that might be true. Okay. Bartamy, do you want to jump in real quick on that, or?
I read
Or you had
something.
indifferent?
Yes,
Okay.
this is something a new subject, if that's okay.
Oh, well, no, I thought you just wanted to. Let me go into
No,
some other people.
it is about Ukraine. It is about
Okay.
Ukraine. And I do think. Can I ask you? Or
Okay. Yeah.
and I do think that. Yesterday I was in a clubhouse space with a bunch of Israelis, and they were discussing an article in the Haaretz, which talked about how if Israel was going to evacuate like Jewish people in close to the Russian border, is that anything? Because Israel has done that in other conflicts, where in Ethiopia, for instance, is that anything you have heard anything about? Or have any thoughts about?
I don't. I mean, I don't have a strong opinion on that. Do you want to about Israel? Sorry, I missed the question.
No. Do you think that is something that will happen? That they're going to evacuate civilian population to Israel or something?
Well, what? I mean, the United
Yes.
States has already evacuated its.
Yes. Forget about that. Ask someone else.
Okay. All right.
I'm sorry.
It's all right. Northern Invader. You have the floor. Northern Invader. You have to unmute your mic. Going once. Going twice. Gone. Okay. Alexa.
Hello, Rich. Can you hear me?
Hey. Yes, I can.
I'm actually part Serbian, part Russian, so I thought I might chime in here.
Oh, good.
Since I'm stationed here in Serbia, but yeah, on my mom's side, lots of Russians. So I thought it's kind of interesting because I've been, sort of active in local politics here and generally in some of this stuff that's been going on. But I find it interesting that there's just a total lack of, I mean, especially, there's just a total lack of a counter narrative in these, at least in these nationalist communities here, in both in Russia and in Serbia, in terms of like, basically, I don't know how to explain this properly, but there is this overwhelming sentiment that essentially kind of mimics the whole Republican Democrats are the real racists narrative. I'm not entirely sure how to explain it, but nationalists here don't necessarily present themselves as even nationalists. They, for the most part, present themselves as the real equalitarians, the ones to have really established, the equalitarian order, and it's the evil sort of Western liberals, eugenicists that kind of sort of present to this major threat to the liberal order. And I just, not to the liberal order, but to the whole nationalist kind of order that was initially all about equality and all that stuff. So I just, it's kind of fascinating to me the degree to which there is essentially a complete lack of a counter narrative to the American, vision. And I don't, that to me is kind of mind-boggling. I don't know how to explain it because, I mean, obviously there are like strategic clashes and geopolitics and everything else, but in terms of like an ideological, like a real countervailing visionary force, there's a complete lack of that. So I find that to be
I mean, I think we've been lacking that for some time. I think we've been lacking a counter narrative vision since '91, pretty much, and the world has been in search of this. I mean, liberalism triumphed, and
yeah, that's
the counter narrative is almost like another version of liberalism. I noticed this when I was in Germany studying German, and I would speak to a lot of different girls, mostly, and from like all over Europe and so on. And I would kind of play a little bit coy about my own opinions, but they would, on the one hand, and this was in the mid 2000s, and so this could be like a girl from Scandinavia or German or whatever. And they'd play this weird game where they would kind of announce their opposition to, say, the Bush administration. And just tell me about how like America is terrible and a bunch of redneck warmongers or whatever. And then they would also announce their like devotion to democracy and pluralism and multiculturalism, and then also announce to me like how with it they were with like American culture, like reality television or like fashion or Paris Hilton or whatever. It was just a very weird kind of thing. I would always notice this, that like opposition to Americanism was always cloaked within like the worst kind of Americanism you could imagine. And, you know, again, Putin does this as well. I mean, you know, it's like, oh, we worry about Ukraine because of the Nazi menace or something, or what? It's all this like liberal narratives that are false, that are used to counter America's liberal narrative. It just shows this. There's a kind of planetary hegemony in terms of Americanism since 1945, or definitely since 1991.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's just something so deeply demoralizing. I recently attended like one of the nationalist party meetings here, and they were discussing
Uh-huh.
history in terms of like um, through that sort of nationalist lens, if
Mhm.
that makes sense. And their understanding of history is literally that we were like everybody was initially and originally an equalitarian in these parts in Eastern Europe in general, and then due to like Western, you know, the evil demonic West, that everybody turned into like a racist, and then they introduced this element of racism that was never there to begin with, and then
Yeah,
that
it's
really
crazy.
caused the collapse. And it's so demoralizing on so many levels, and I can't get behind some of these nationalist politics. It's
Yeah,
completely mind-boggling.
yeah, yeah. I totally agree, but it kind of tells us something about the world we live in. All right, let me take one or two more, and then I'm gonna head home. So, Lightning Patriot, you have the floor.
Okay. Can I have two or three on my mind?
Okay.
But I actually have kind of seen some of the points you've made, Alexa. Alex? What? However
Yeah,
you
you can just call
pronounce it.
me Alex. It's fine.
It's
This
cool.
is a
It's cool. It's cool.
Slavic
It's cool.
version of Alex.
Okay, it's a lot of version, Alex. Yeah, because I've seen that coming from some kind of like pro Russian, pro Serbian sentiment. Kind of, there's a lot of mingling because I remember seeing this in 2016, like when people, including myself, had very pro Novorossiya sentiment. Just seeing this sort of trust Trump, trust Trump, trust Trump. How dare if you don't trust Trump, you're a glowy or something. But like they were sort of like getting people to vote Republican and stuff like that. And I was just like, I don't even trust this guy as as someone of my religious background. I just like, I was just sort of the stay home position in 2016 and 2020, but that's another thing. It's kind of funny that there's this sort of alliance between what we have, like it's literally the America First, kind of movement, kind of has this weird alliance with like Russian nationalists who back them. They don't back a lot of dissident groups here who actually kind of have more of a vision, varying degrees. But they just sort of shill for American nationalism, which is like, if your country's being bombed by the United States, wouldn't you do the opposite? Wouldn't you kind of be, because I remember there was a period where there was some, kind of like hinted Russian support for some, Southern secessionist groups and stuff like that. But then it's like flipped around, like, no, we're, amnats. It's kind of weird. In that respect, but
I think I said this on my space a week ago. I mean, I think that the Russian position is they aren't so bold as to support like an actual secessionist movement in the United States, and B, I think it's debatable whether supporting Biden or Trump is actually in their best strategic interest. I mean, Biden has canceled some sanctions that were put forth in the tail end of the first Trump administration, that that basically were a kind of response to liberal criticism. We're like, oh, you think we're pro-Russia? Well, watch us go. We're going to
Yeah.
sanction the hell out of them. And so Biden has actually been fairly reasonable. I mean, keep in mind, vis-a-vis his Secretary of State and vis-a-vis a lot of people in the media, Biden is like Mr. Realist up here, kind of being. So there's actually no like rational reason for Russia to be pro-Trump. And Putin himself has said, like, oh, well, the president's changed, the policy stays the same. I just think Russia is, as an understandable response to the West, engaging in a kind of chaos strategy of just, like, promoting the worst nonsense imaginable. And it's just extremely frustrating. And it's also led me to conclude that Russia actually doesn't have like Americans' interest at heart, best interest at heart. It doesn't have the West or the white race or whatever you want to say, best interest at heart. It's just kind of like, let's throw a bunch of spaghetti up against the wall, like the most QAnon level stuff, and let's just see what happens. We'll play with that stuff in the cybersphere through the
Snobby
internet
troll
research.
kids.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just nonsense. And I in some ways have lost respect for them. If you take my drift, it's like they don't actually have a vision for anything. It's just, I don't know. They're just kind of dumb. And, again, it goes back to what I was saying like 20 minutes ago. There's just this real disconnect, and maybe it's a linguistic one, at its foundation, between like American dissident thinkers and Russians. I don't see this like walking hand in hand. And when they do, when you have a figure like Charles Bausman or something, who's either some kind of Russian agent or a wannabe Russian agent, it's just like January 6th here nonsense. And then he flees the country immediately.
I wasn't surprised when you brought that up, that he was at J6, and there's some questions with some people in the movement he's connected to, where it's just kind of like, oh, it kind of all comes together, and at least
he's supporting
least for me.
TRS.
Just like Stryker was like forwarded on Steve Bannon's channel as a respected journalist. I mean,
it's just it gets to the point where you're like, all right, guys, like it's not, there's no like long-term vision there. It's just totally tactical, totally immediate nonsense that they are promoting as a kind of like FU effort. It's not even
literally
like
sticking up a middle finger,
literally sticking up a middle finger.
It's literally, because you've kind of seen this with like the the current president stuff. It's it's like literally F, because I remember seeing that around last year, before the Capitol incident. It was like people, you had like Proud Boys out on the street fighting Antifa. Some I mean, I wouldn't say it, I don't think they were all glowies or whatever, but there was definitely Roger Stone ops going on there. But it's like F Antifa, like that's your chance. It's
what's
just
your
like
point? Yeah,
it's like now you're sticking up the rainbow flag,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's just very disappointing and very just low level.
Yeah.
And it's just there's nothing there.
And it kind of goes on the left too. I mean, that's just a very long history of Russia's sort of influence, if you could call it that, in the United States. It's just they're doing on the right or the GOP side of the equation as of late. Yeah. Or I remember reading something about Serbian nationalists having connections to like white nationalists in the 90s.
That is, actually, I guess I should speak up on that.
Sure.
That is partially true, but it's, I don't know how to explain. I mean, Alain de Benoit, like the French New Right, I guess to a degree was also connected, and then he sort of denounced the entirety of the project, said that this is actually we're the real like multiculturalists. We want to promote like the independence of each culture, and you guys are racist or whatever. I think even explicitly stated that, as far as I know. But it's this weird kind of thing. Yeah, there is sort of like there's definitely a kind of alliance in the sense that there is this, overarching kind of opposition to the American order, but it's a totally disoriented opposition. It doesn't, it's aimless. There's just no fundamental clash. There's no like fundamental, ideological paradigm upon which to base
I
conflict.
remember,
No.
I got in this thing around 2016, and I remember talking to people on Discord in 2017. It's like, do you have any, like as people are going out into protests, and it's just like, you think this is the Soviet Union, and you're not gonna, try to protect your personal identity, just like with, all of these, cells operating out there, collecting your information and like trying to get you fired. Wouldn't you at least have some countermeasures if you're going to do activism? Sort of like what Patriot Front now does, and although there's problems with that now, but they've done it pretty well for 4.5 years, I think, for an org that's a significant period of time. But
well, they got it. Yeah. They got doxxed out the wazoo recently.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the problem with orgs as opposed to, I guess you could say, networks. I'm not sure if anyone has an opinion on networks, but what was it? Because that's something I noticed in 2016 with the kind of WN kind of like support for Trump. Yeah, like I said, with Seville, like a lot of people. The main point being is that, when I was talking to a lot of people leading up to Seville, it's like, do you have like a vision for what vision you want to present to the public? Like not a plan or anything like that, but just a lot of nationalist movements, they just have a vision of what the country is and who the people are, and, a kind of connection that it's like, okay, so this is what, your people is, and I would argue that there was kind of that with, some of the Southern nationalists. There was like, yeah, we have our own thing. It's very clear we're being wiped out. And I think that, I'm not sure if that was exactly a winning position, but it was definitely something where you could easily argue, yeah, this government, we have like a tension with, those in power. We have our own thing, sort of like, I would argue, nationalist movements in the Soviet Union. That's just kind of how I see it.
All right. Okay, let's. I want to let Boris Evesev. Boris, would you like to jump in?
Yes, thank you, Richard.
Sure.
I'm a regular at your spaces, even though this is my first time to speak. And as you bemoaned the lack of Russians, I decided that I need to rectify it. I'm Russian, but not pro-Russian in the sense that has been discussed here, and I live in the U.S. So a couple of quick things. I completely agree with your characterization of Putin as, that notion that Putin is some sort of a trad savior of the white civilization is totally laughable. Yeah. It's Putin is in every time he engages in these kind of upping the stakes games, he's solving his domestic problems for the most part. He's kind of catering to some domestic issue that in his perception needs addressed, and he's largely LARPing. I mean, all the traditional stuff, the Russian Orthodox Church that has been dramatically elevated during his rule. I mean, it's basically a racket that's living off the federal budget there. Now, the question why Ukraine, a number of people have articulated here. I do not believe that the idea is to invade and grab territory in Ukraine and somehow make it, part of the greater Russia. Putin's goal in Ukraine is to destabilize Ukraine from the inside. I've recently come across a pretty credible analysis of the real kind of forces that Russia has amassed around the border and what Ukraine has at its disposal to counter that. And basically, the functional proportion between the Russian and the Ukrainian forces in terms of what is likely to be used, not just the number of rusty tanks and other obsolete stuff that Russia can own, or aircraft that is just not fit to fight the kind of warfare that is likely to be fought there. The real ratio is 2-to-1, and given that Russia would be fighting that war on a hostile territory, and there's over the past 7 years since 2014, Ukraine, the disposition of Ukrainians has changed pretty dramatically toward Russia. I mean, Ukraine was the friendliest country toward Russia.
Mm-hmm.
Have a lot of very angry and very, hostile people there. So it's not going to be a very easy war to fight for Putin. And 2-to-1 is simply not enough for a successful campaign or a quick campaign, a campaign that he would be seeking most likely, which is relatively bloodless. And this is if he goes head on, if he starts a full-on invasion, it's likely to be a lot of blood and a lot of caskets coming back home, and it's something that the price is unacceptable. Simply, it's too high for him to. It could destabilize Putin's regime itself.
So you think it's all posturing?
Well, it's not all posturing. I think we're still likely to see some military engagement, some kind of small provocations, perhaps along the border. There's a case that someone made that I've heard that kind of sounds right. That it might those provocations might happen along the Ukraine-Belarus border, and in that case, it's even more muddled because technically it's not Russia that invaded, but Belarus, and Belarus is just a Russian satellite. There's nothing autonomous or sovereign about Belarus anymore. But Belarus now hosts tens of thousands of Russian troops because they're going through those joint military exercises that are curiously scheduled to end on February 20th, which is the same date the Olympic Games will end. And the rumor has it that Xi Jinping, in a recent conversation with Putin, asked him not to start any military action in Ukraine or elsewhere, before the Olympic Games are over. So whether it's true or not, I have no idea. But China certainly holds considerable sway over what happens there. If you look at what happened in Kazakhstan, for instance, that's something that we haven't talked about. But Kazakhstan is another case where there is a considerable Russian population, probably about 3 million, which is almost 25% right now of the total, where Putin could conceivably make a case that their rights are somehow violated, and it's actually true. It's a very soft. I wouldn't call it violation, but the Russians have been kind of squeezed out of, government positions and, in general, positions of influence and more lucrative jobs and so forth in Kazakhstan. But it's been very gradual and very, very soft. So Putin brought several thousand troops in response to a request by President of Kazakhstan when he was facing riots there that kind of, for a moment, looked like there was a full-blown revolution. So Putin seemingly, I mean, there were a lot of voices that suggested that was his. He was delighted to do that because that's an opportunity to grab territory. But again, reportedly, China holds, and that's actually a verifiable fact, that China has a lot more influence over what happens in Kazakhstan because they have a degree of control over oil-producing regions and oil-producing companies, and in general in the economy that allows China to be a major player in decisions like that. So basically, China very quietly and very gently asked Putin, after a week of being on the ground in Kazakhstan, to help a local president in the time of trouble. Okay, your mission is now accomplished. Now leave. Nobody knows to what extent China will be playing those kind of behind-the-scenes games with Putin regarding Ukraine, and China has much less of a stake in Ukraine, but shouldn't be dismissed altogether. So that's kind of long, but thank you for.
Yeah, no, that's very insightful. All right, let's do this. I'll let one more Northern Invader. You're the last one, and then I'm going to call it quits. But you had requested earlier. Oh, let me let you in. Hold on. There you are. All right. So you are in. You have the floor, and then I'm going to call it quits. All right. You have to unmute your mic. Northern Invader, going once, going twice, gone. All right, everyone, thank you for participating. There was a lot of good insights in this discussion, and I always appreciate it. And thank you all for listening as well. So I will talk to everyone soon. All right, ciao, bye-bye.